How y'all doing? This is MongoSlade, and all aboard the delusional train. Eric Bischoff has jumped on. Eric Bischoff says, quote, I don't think NXT is as good as TNA wrestling at its peak. Oh boy. So I'm going to read a I'm going to read a oh my god. Okay, I'm going to read a transcription from Fightful. This is from his podcast, apparently. Oh, he says, quote, I don't think NXT is as good as TNA when it was at its peak. Now, at its peak is subjective, right? Some people like TNA when it first started because it was new. I get that. There's value in that. There's a valuation you could apply to that fact. A lot of people liked it because it felt different in the very beginning. Some people like that smaller presentation more than anything. Everybody loves a competitor, right? Because you get your hopes up and you start getting interested in something new, fresh characters that you hadn't seen before. But if you go back and look at its TNA in terms of its peak across the boards, not for a moment in time, but for an extended period of time across the boards in terms of television ratings, pay-per-view buys, and house show attendance, and that's going to be that period of time that I was describing earlier, right around the time of Aces and Eights, peak storyline period with Brooke Hogan and Bully Ray, and all of that when they were putting 2,500, 3,500, 5,000 people in a venue. Yes, they did, and they actually paid for it. I don't know that NXT is doing anything better than TNA was when TNA was at its peak. I would be pretty sure if I was a betting man that I would bet that there are a lot more resources being pumped into NXT than there ever were being pumped into TNA. All right, so there's a lot to unpack here. There's a lot to unpack. All right, so first things first, I think this is an unfair comparison. The reason why it's unfair is because NXT is a subsidiary of the WWE. So I could literally just say NXT takeover shows. Some of the takeover shows have completely outdrawn anything TNA has ever done. That will, of course, be unfair because a lot of those shows were paired with SummerSlam or Royal Rumble or WrestleMania or some other type of WWE event. Now, when they did standalone events where there was no weekend of WWE stuff, they still did more than 5,000 people. Now, it's also an unfair comparison because NXT is a studio show that operates out of a small building. So NXT's they do one show. They used to do house show loop, but their house show loops were always in small venues. It was never meant to be what TNA was supposed to be. TNA was supposed to be a completely independent promotion. Doing 5,000 people is probably a big deal for them, but 5,000 people for WWE is a massive failure, right? So NXT being a subsidiary of WWE, it was expected to get smaller audiences around the Ring of Honor level of about 1,000, 1,500, around this TNA level of people. But again, it's also a subsidiary of WWE, so there's always going to be an unfair range. And that also continues into other, when you look at things every other way. But the reason why it's also an unfair comparison is that WWE NXT is a developmental brand. I don't know why people keep forgetting. It is developmental. It is not its own entity. Okay? NXT, if it was starting to grow, right? Eventually the top stars from NXT leave. That's kind of how it's always been. Like, imagine what NXT would be if none of the top stars ever left. If Kevin Owens was still there, Finn Balor never left, Shinsuke Nakamura never left, Sami Zayn never left, Neville never left. It would be a completely different brand than it is today. The reason why NXT operates out of a small venue is because it doesn't have a stable structure. The top guys are meant to leave. You know, this year alone, they lost a ton of top guys and girls. You know, so it's a completely unfair comparison. So, if you want to take out all of the business metrics, which is what Eric Bischoff is talking about, you know, in TV ratings, NXT is not the TV draw that TNA was. TNA was doing 1 million viewers, maybe 1.5 million. But it was a completely different time in TV. You're talking about what Aces and Eights was in 2012, 2013. That's 8 years ago. This was before a lot. Well, there was some cord cutting back then, but it wasn't a lot. Now, you're talking about a lot of cord cutting. TNA, if it were on TV today, would probably be doing around the NXT AEW range. It'd probably be about 800, 900,000, maybe. And that's because they did have some top talent in at the time, because they had Flair. If I remember, Flair was still there. I think Hogan was also still there. So you had that bump, just kind of how Jericho was on AEW. They get an extra bump for that. There was the Hogan bump, and then there was a lot of familiar faces that were in TNA at the same time. So you could give them credit for all of that. So I would think, because TNA was a completely separate entity from anything else, it was separate from any other promotion, even though they did have some cross promotion with smaller promotions. I'm not so sure it would be that different as far as TV interest is concerned. But when he says that I bet that there are a lot more resources pumped into NXT than there ever was being pumped into TNA. I agree with that. Now, the reason is because WWE owns the Performance Center, which is and they also rent out. I'm pretty sure they don't own Full Sail. I'm pretty sure they rent that building out, and it's probably expensive because it's Florida, property taxes and all that type of stuff. And you have, and you do sign some people to big contracts to be in NXT for a short time, and then they move on to Raw or SmackDown or something like that. So maybe. But I think that at its peak, TNA actually probably spent more on pyro than NXT spent on most things. Again, NXT is a very stripped down product. It doesn't have the best lighting in the world. It's supposed to mimic, or sort of like supposed to mimic Ring of Honor a little bit. It's supposed to mimic the Indies. TNA was supposed to be the number 2 wrestling promotion in the country, meaning they had really professional lighting at the time. They did pyro. They had professional camera crew and commentary. NXT still operates off of trainees. Everyone, the camera crew are trainees. The commentary team are somewhat professional. There's a mixture of professionals, and I guess Vic Joseph is a professional. Wade Barrett has a lot of experience doing this type of stuff. So does Beth Phoenix. But a lot of the people who operate NXT are basically trainees. It's not exactly a fair comparison. And this is the same thing when people talk about AEW, right? People are like, AEW is kicking NXT's ass. I'm like, NXT is basically a fucking school. Like I said before, it's essentially the NCAA, comparing it to the NFL or the NBA. It doesn't have the same level of investment. It doesn't have the same goals. It doesn't even have the same structure. It is a third brand, a subsidiary in a feeder system for Raw and SmackDown. If NXT had to operate on its own, without any help from Raw and SmackDown, then the roster will look vastly different. There would be a lot of people who get a lot of time on NXT probably wouldn't even be on the show if it had to survive on its own. And I can pretty sure that NXT would probably be a better product then. They'd probably actually put some fucking money into it. They'd probably go and do more in terms of travel and promotion and different things like that. They don't even really promote NXT that well, So I think that it'd probably be better to compare TNA to AEW. And I think that there probably is a lot more money spent on AEW than it was spent on TNA. And I think that it's probably not fair because AEW hasn't been around that long. And that would make that an unfair comparison. And of course, TV ratings are different now compared to then. But hell, AEW gets around the ratings that the TNA used to get. It's in the same ballpark. A 2012, 2013 TNA versus a 2019, 2020 AEW. That's probably pretty even as far as talent is concerned, booking is concerned, storylines, all that type of stuff. Even though I probably would have preferred TNA, and I don't even remember it that well. I just kind of been going back looking at random matches from TNA from this era, and it was very enjoyable. Like I said, the Lance Storm, James Storm, Bobby Roode feud, the Kurt Angle stuff with Roode and Storm, and the Hogan Fortune stuff, and I think Fortune was what 2010. Around that time, you had Fortune, uh, you had what was I forget what other groups were around, but there were a lot of other groups around, and they were bringing in some names and they were bringing in some talent. But so I can't really, I don't get what Bischoff is trying to go with here. Like I get that on the business metrics it might be kind of true, but NXT has been a long, long money loser for WWE. It really just started making its own money when it went on TV, because it's a feeder system. It's a school. It's basically a school. So I don't understand why people are in such a rush to compare the two. But it's an interesting conversation, and it makes some people might want to discuss it. But I didn't look at what. Matter of fact, let's do that right now. Let's take a look at the last NXT house show and see what it drew. All right, I haven't been able to find it, and but most people seem to believe that they do better out when the Florida loops are a couple of hundred, and then they do a couple thousand outside of Florida. But of course the brand is built on the Florida loops, for you to actually go travel. So it's hard to tell what the attendance is for NXT, and I'm not about to pay anybody like Meltzer or anything like that to find out. So, and plus it doesn't really make that much of a difference as far as I'm concerned. Uh, I watched TNA during this era. I don't remember that much of it, if we're being honest. I'm not as cool or as deep into the TNA history as I was than I am with the WWE history. So I couldn't tell you what was I went back and looked at some TNA, but I couldn't give you a hard and fast breakdown of what was going on in TNA at the time. I do remember that a lot of the Brooke Hogan stuff with Bully Ray was real cringy. I do remember a lot of that stuff, but I do remember Ace and Eights being pretty good, especially the Devon reveal when they revealed that it was Devon under that hood. I think it was at a Bound for Glory or was that some pay-per-view where Hogan turned babyface. I think he had a match with Sting or something like that, or it was something to that effect. But I remember that whole reveal of it being Devon was really dope. And I can admit, the Aces and Eights storyline is definitely better than what NXT has been doing recently, because it was a longer form story that involved a lot of different characters and some mystery and some reveals and stuff like that, where NXT had not even tried to do anything like that. Haven't even attempted it. I would like it if they would try it, but that's different. I could give them that bump. Yeah, Aces and Eights as a storyline was better than what NXT has been doing, because a lot of the NXT storylines have been interrupted by injury, especially lately. The Karrion Kross injury and Keith Lee leaving. But they did a good job of building bigger stars on NXT. And but I think TNA did a good job with Bobby Roode and Austin Aries. They did a good job with him. They did a good job with James Storm. I guess they did a great job with EC3. Even though I'm not really a big fan of EC3, they made him very important. Magnus, who ended up being Nick Aldis. I think he was also the champion around that time. But then it kind of fell off a cliff because they started doing the whole Global Force stuff, and the Owl situation came, and they brought in Matt Hardy. But I think this was past TNA's peak by this point. I think TNA's peak was long past before, around the time EC3 was the champion or the time Magnus was the champion, the company started to die. After that, I think that's post Hogan. Those guys were like post Hogan. Like, it's crazy we have to talk about TNA. Like, there's the pre-Hogan years, the Hogan years, and then the post-Hogan years. And it says a lot that, once Flair left and Booker T left, and I think Booker T was there in like 2007, so I shouldn't say that. But after Hogan left, after Sting left, after Foley left, after Flair left, it fell off a cliff. I think that says a lot. I think it says a lot. because then after the older guys left, then some of the younger guys started to leave. That's when you had AJ Styles leave, and then you had some other. But that was probably the biggest loss that they took was when AJ Styles left. It was a completely different brand after AJ Styles left. That was like ripping the soul out of TNA. It became like a gray husk after that. They should have just changed the brand after AJ Styles left. It would be that would be like taking Hulk Hogan out of the WWE in 1988 or something like that. It was that devastating because he was like their guy, But I'm going all over the place. Let me know what you guys think. Do you think that TNA at its peak is better than AEW? I'm going to add AEW or NXT. If you think so, let me know in the comment section below. If you don't, feel free to argue with Eric Bischoff. And thank you guys for listening. Like, share, donate if you can. Thank you for your time, and I'll talk to you guys later.